hurt, when it comes to that. But it's taken me a long time to get beyond that, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
And that may have been the first time, but it wasn't the last time. And so the plot thickens, So I went back to live with my mother, and they had moved from the east side of Attleboro, which was not a very nice neighborhood, and we were moving on up. We were like the Jeffersons. We moved into the projects. And a little bit of the opposite, but we moved into the projects. My mother had gotten remarried to a gentleman. His name was Bud. He was a raving alcoholic. He was physically and verbally abusive to my mother. So I just left this environment with my dad. I moved back to be with my mom, who's in a new relationship. She's married to, like I said, a raving alcoholic who's smacking her around. And she still had dealt with issues of depression and that because of... I think it's important for me to say that my mother was in love with my father. And my father was never in love with my mom. Mm. And when my dad left my mother for another woman, that crushed her. And, one of the things that we learn in our walk with Christ is that everybody has a story. And everybody deals with certain things, and everybody's been wounded, and everybody's been hurt in their life. And looking back on it now as an adult male, I could see where my mother was emotionally crippled by my father. I think that they both had felt like they were going to get away from the environment that they grew up in. They were going to get a fresh start. And what happened is they just brought the garbage into the marriage with them. They brought the baggage, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And instead of rescuing one another, they just damaged each other even more, So I went back. I lived with my mom and my new stepdad. And we had some goes. I've never been one to hold back how I feel about situations. Quite honestly, to be honest with you, I was very, very vocal, even more vocal than I am. And most people know that I'm vocal that know me. But I live with a certain amount of arrogance and a certain amount of cockiness and confidence. And I had no problem telling, at the age of 10 and 11, telling my mother's husband what was up. I can remember one incident where I walked in on him with my mom's head over the arm of the couch pulling her hair, and I grabbed the vacuum cleaner hose, and I was getting ready to go to town on him. My mother obviously jumped in between the two of us, and of course I don't think I would have done much. I mean, I was 11. He was a grown man, but hey, I was going for it. So I'd lived with them for a little bit, and then I decided my 8th grade year that I'd had enough of that, so I decided I was going to try living with my dad again. And my dad had just recently had left his second wife, was in the process of leaving his second wife. He'd give me the bill of goods about how it was going to be just him and I. It was going to be the two of us. And so I bought into that hook, line, and sinker, flew out there. First night that we were there was one of the best nights of my life. I spent the night there. The next morning, we packed up his stuff, hitched up his boat, and we pulled out of the driveway, and she was standing there, and I was waving goodbye to her with one finger. And
I bet you were.
And it was, and I know looking back on that, that wasn't a very godly thing to do, a mature thing to do, but when you're 13, 14 years old and somebody's caused you that much heartache and that much pain.
Hey, you're in survival mode
and
there, brother.
You feel like, you've even though God wasn't a part of my life, I felt like God had rescued me from a part of my life, that a prison that I was in.
Absolutely.
And so it was just like, redemption,
Right.
That was very short-lived, because when my father and I pulled out of the house and moved into the new place we were going, it wasn't too much longer he moved his new girlfriend in, that I guess he had hooked up with at work. So he had cheated on my mother with his second wife, and he had cheated on his second wife with his third wife. The only difference was this time she had 2 children, and so we were living with a friend of his, sharing a room in the back of his house. He moved his girlfriend in with her 2 kids. So my dream of quality time, just the two of us, him and I, that was shortly lived, and it was came to a screeching halt. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of resentment at that point in time. I was very angry. I was very disappointed, and I was very hurt. I felt like my dad sold me out. Again, but I want to say that my father is a very wounded man. I touched on just a little small part of his life in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
He was very wounded by his father. He was very wounded by his mother.
Right.
Sure.
And the way they were brought up, they didn't know any other way.
Yeah.
So.
He was seeking validity in a woman. I know firsthand about that because later on in my life, that's exactly what I did.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and so my dad, we moved in, and she had moved her children in, and there was a lot of tension. I was in the 8th grade, a young teenager, straight out of the projects in Massachusetts. I didn't have a filter on my mouth by any means, and I had no problem telling you how I felt about something. So it was it was a very intense situation. And I was already aggravated and frustrated with the situation, so there's a lot of hostility. And instead of channeling that anger, that frustration at my father, I tended to channel it at his now his wife at the time and her 2 children. She was actually going through a bitter divorce at the time as well. Her husband, and I shared this at Real Men. It's not something I share a lot with a lot of people because it really, really bothers me. Her husband talked her son into conjuring up a story about me, saying that I fondled him so he could get custody of his children. What ended up coming out of it all was, I guess I was wrestling with him one time, and when I picked him up to power slam him, my palm had grazed him in the crotch. And he was telling his dad, and so his father fed on that and jumped all over it. And so next thing I know, the sheriff's department showing up at the house. I'm being falsely accused of being a pedophile, so to speak, or, a little diddler. And the most hurtful thing that came out of that for me was the fact that there was like a restrainer on me and her children. I was not allowed to be around her children. So on the weekends, my father was spending the weekends with her and her children while I was at home by myself. So there was a lot of resentment that went on there. After it all panned out and it all came out in the wash, we ended up leaving his buddy's house, and we ended up moving to her and her ex-husband's house. So now we're moving into her home, her kid's home. I'm already, I hate to use this term, but I'm already pissed off. I mean, to be honest with you. It was just a bad situation. And I stayed there from my 8th grade year through my 9th grade year. I went to 5 different schools in that time period. I don't know if any of you know how difficult it is to be a freshman in high school. Try being a freshman 4 different times, 4 different schools. So there was a lot of resentment there. So enough was enough, and I left. I went back to Massachusetts again. Mm-hmm. As you can see, there's a trend going on here. Going, running to, running from. Trying to find something that I was never going to find. I was coming up empty. Quite honestly, my father couldn't give me what I wanted. He didn't know how to give it to me, So I went back to Massachusetts. It was my sophomore year. And I remember moving back with my mom. In my mom's home, there was never any rules or regulations. I could come and go as I pleased. I did what I wanted. My mother's philosophy was better to do at home than somewhere else. It was my sophomore year that I actually met my first love. And actually I dated her for 5 years, the same girl for 5 years. It was not uncommon for her and I to spend the night together at my mother's house. Matter of fact, she was 15, I was 16. We would share the same room, the same bed. My mother had no rules, no boundaries. My friends would come over. We would drink in the basement, smoke pot in the basement. My friends would smoke. We would take turns being promiscuous with our girlfriends in the basement. It was just a free-for-all. I had no curfew. I could stay out as late as I wanted to. I could go where I wanted to. I could do what I wanted to. By the grace of God, I would never really, I dabbled a little bit with marijuana as a kid. My friends were all doing it. I never really cared for it too much, but I did try it. but it was just not something I ever stuck with, and something that was a big deal for me. Alcohol was never really a big thing for me at that time of my life as far as being a teenager, but that girl in my life was. It was the first time in my life that I felt like somebody loved just me. It was rewarding, and yet it was very damaging. She got pregnant when she was 15 and a half, and I'm 16. You think you know it all. You think you got it all figured out. You're looking at this girl that you're madly in love with, or you think you're madly in love with. And her mom shows up one day, she's pregnant, and the next day she shows up and she's not. Her mom had taken her for an abortion, and that's not something that I'm proud of. And I look back on it now as an adult man. I could have done something. I could have said something. But the reality of it, looking back on it, is it was easier not to. And because of that, that brings a great deal of shame and regret, you know. I like to say that I learned my lesson, but it wasn't about a year and a half later that she was pregnant again. And the sad thing was, it was because we definitely weren't taking the precautions to make sure that she wouldn't get pregnant. You're young, you think, oh, I'm in love with this person. This is the one for me. But this time she ended up having a miscarriage. It was upstairs in my mom's bathroom. And I'll tell you something, when you're 17 and you walk in on your 17-year-old girlfriend having a miscarriage, it's not a pleasant sight. You grow up pretty quick. Mm-hmm. My mother lived in a housing project, and I was working during this time, though. I'd met her dad. Her dad was a foreman. He was a construction worker. I started working with him, and so when I was 17, I actually moved out of my mother's house. I was told that because she was with the housing authority that either I was going to pay half the rent or I had to get out. And as stupid or weird as it may sound, back then I told myself, I ain't paying to live in the projects, you know. I live here because I have to. I grew up here because my mother's on welfare. I mean, I'm not going to pay to live here, you know what I mean? So my girlfriend and I, we moved out together. We moved into an apartment. A year later, she was pregnant again. This time I found her in the kitchen, 2 o'clock in the morning, curled up in a corner, screaming. Had to rush her to the emergency room. She had a tubal pregnancy. You think that you'd learn from your mistakes, you know? But you're young. You think you got it all figured out. We continued to stay together for a little period of time. We were together for 5 years. And then finally we were like fire and gasoline. One of them relationships where, you know, you drop a match on it, something's liable to explode. There was a lot of passion. There was a lot of love at that time, but it was very volatile. We had 2 kids trying to be adults, having 2 different ideas of what life was going to be, you know. Mm-hmm. So,
but you both saw different ends of life as you grew up, too.
Well, she actually come from even a worse background than I did. I mean, she floated from home to home. She lived with, her mother had 7 sisters. She lived with every single one of them, lived with her meme and her pepe, lived with her dad. She was bounced around her entire life. She didn't know what it was to be loved. You know, she'd never experienced true love in her life. And then she had felt like she'd experienced that from me, which it was. It was genuine and it was true for the time. But, I mean, come on, you're a 16-year-old kid. What do you really know about love? Mm-hmm. You know, what do you know about responsibility? You don't. You think you do, but you don't. And even progressing into being 18, 19, and then, you know, finally the relationship was just one of them deals where it was just so rocky and volatile that it finally had come to an end. And that's when I found myself standing and looking at myself in the mirror. I was living in a town called South Attleboro with a buddy of mine. I was sleeping on his couch, and I was working construction about 80 hours a week, chasing our money, checks bouncing all the time. We were drinking a little bit, hanging out, and I remember looking at myself one night in the mirror saying, who in the hell are you? Who are you? Who is this guy? Because you've become everything that you've despised in your life. And a couple of days later, my roommate at the time had a recruiter come to the house because he'd always wanted to be in the service. I had never really thought about being in the service. It wasn't something that really crossed my mind, but I figured, hey, I'll hang out. I'll listen to what the guy says. My buddy's going to go in the Army. He had a felony, so he wasn't able to get in, but I remember watching this